My name is Robert, and I am 73 years old. The story I'm about to tell you happened in 1972, when I was just 20 years old, working my first real job at a funeral home in rural Pennsylvania. More than 50 years have passed since that night, but I can still hear the sound that came from that preparation room. A sound that should never come from someone who has been declared dead for 6 hours. I never planned to work in the funeral business. In the fall of 1972, I was a community college dropout with no clear direction in life, living with my mother in a small town outside of Pittsburgh. My mother had recently started dating a man named Frank, who owned and operated Holloway & Sons Funeral Home, a family business that had served our community for 3 generations. Frank was a good man, patient, kind, and generous with my mother and me, despite having no obligation to be. When he learned I was struggling to find work, he offered me a position as a night assistant at the funeral home. The pay was decent for 1972, and the work, while unusual, seemed straightforward enough. I would help with basic tasks, answering phones, maintaining the facility, assisting with body preparation when Frank needed an extra set of hands. "It's honest work," Frank told me when he made the offer. "Not glamorous, and some people find it unsettling, but someone has to do it. If you can handle being around the deceased and you follow procedures exactly, you'll do fine." I accepted the position, partly because I needed the money, but mostly because I wanted to make a good impression on Frank. My mother seemed happier than she had been in years, and I didn't want to be the wayward son who caused problems in her new relationship. My training consisted of 2 weeks working day shifts with Frank, learning the business operations, embalming procedures, and the countless small tasks that keep a funeral home running. Frank was meticulous in his instruction, emphasizing that our work required absolute respect for the deceased and their families. "These people trust us with their loved ones during the worst moments of their lives," Frank would say. "We have a sacred responsibility to treat every body with dignity, follow every procedure carefully, and never ever take shortcuts or treat this work casually." The funeral home itself was a large Victorian house that had been converted for commercial use in the 1920s. The main floor contained viewing rooms, a chapel, and Frank's office. The basement housed the preparation room where embalming took place, along with storage for supplies and equipment. The building was old, with creaking floors, outdated plumbing, and the kind of small noises that any old structure makes as it settles. Frank lived in an apartment above the funeral home with his teenage son, which meant someone was always on site if emergencies arose. But the night shift, which ran from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., was typically quiet. Most of my work involved being present in case a body arrived from the hospital or medical examiner, maintaining the facility, and occasionally assisting with embalming preparation for next-day funerals. For the first 3 months, the work was exactly as Frank had described, routine, sometimes boring, but manageable. I became comfortable with the solitude of night shift, the quiet hours spent reading in the office or maintaining equipment. The presence of bodies in the preparation room or viewing rooms no longer unsettled me. Death had become familiar, clinical, part of the job rather than something that provoked fear or discomfort. The building did make noises at night, old wood expanding and contracting, pipes settling, the furnace cycling on and off. At first, these sounds would startle me. My imagination conjuring supernatural explanations before reason reminded me that old buildings are simply noisy. But after a few weeks, I learned to distinguish between normal building sounds and anything that might require investigation. Frank had laughed when I mentioned the building's noises during my first week. "People like to say funeral homes are haunted," he told me. "Occupational superstition. But I've worked here for 25 years, and I've never seen anything that couldn't be explained by old plumbing and a 100-year-old building settling on its foundation." The night that changed everything started ordinarily enough. It was November 17th, 1972, a Thursday evening, cold and damp with early winter settling over Pennsylvania. I had arrived for my shift at 6 p.m., and Frank briefed me on the evening's work before heading upstairs to his apartment. "We have one arrival expected tonight. Frank said, checking his notes. Hospital called this afternoon. Elderly woman, natural causes. Family has requested immediate preparation for Saturday viewing. She should arrive around 8 p.m. I'll come down to help with the intake and initial prep work. Then you can finish the basic procedures while I handle the administrative work. Understood, I said, making notes about the case. Anything unusual about this one? No, straightforward case. Just follow standard procedures. The body arrived at 8:15 p.m. in an unmarked van from St. Anne's Hospital, about 15 miles away. The driver handed me the transfer paperwork. The deceased was Dorothy Ward, 76 years old, who had been admitted to the hospital 3 days earlier with pneumonia. Her condition had deteriorated rapidly, and she had been pronounced dead at 2 p.m. that afternoon by Dr. Gerald Foster, the attending physician. Frank and I transferred Mrs. Ward's body to the preparation room and began the intake procedures. We verified her identity against the paperwork, documented her physical condition, and prepared her for the embalming process. Everything appeared routine. An elderly woman who had died from natural causes, showing the typical signs of pneumonia in her final days. I'll get started on the paperwork and contact her family about Saturday arrangements, Frank said after we completed the initial preparation. You can begin the washing and positioning. I'll be back down in about 30 minutes to start the arterial embalming. Frank headed upstairs, leaving me alone in the preparation room with Mrs. Ward's body. The room was brightly lit, with white tile walls that reflected the overhead fluorescent lights. The embalming table was stainless steel, equipped with drainage systems and all the instruments needed for body preparation. A radio in the corner played softly. Frank believed that some ambient noise made the work less isolating during night shifts. I began the washing procedure, carefully cleaning Mrs. Ward's body and preparing her for the embalming process. This was routine work I had performed dozens of times during my 3 months at the funeral home. I worked methodically, following the procedures Frank had taught me, maintaining the professional detachment necessary for this kind of work. I had been working for perhaps 15 minutes when I first heard the sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the radio and the sound of running water. A low moan, soft and prolonged, lasting maybe 2 seconds. I paused in my work, listening carefully. The sound didn't repeat, and I convinced myself it was just the building's plumbing or perhaps something from Frank's apartment upstairs. I resumed working, but I felt uneasy in a way I hadn't experienced during previous shifts. The sound had been strange, not quite like pipes or building noises I had become familiar with. But I pushed the unease aside, focusing on the task at hand. 5 minutes later, I heard it again, louder this time, unmistakable. A low, drawn-out moan that seemed to come from the direction of the embalming table where Mrs. Ward's body lay. I stopped working completely, standing perfectly still and listening. The sound didn't repeat. I looked at Mrs. Ward's body, which remained motionless on the table. Her chest showed no movement. Her face was peaceful and still. Dead bodies can make sounds as gases shift or are released, I reminded myself. Frank had warned me about this. Post-mortem sounds that could be startling but were perfectly natural and didn't indicate anything supernatural. I tried to return to work, but my earlier ease had evaporated. I kept glancing at Mrs. Ward's body, watching for any movement, listening for any sounds. The room, which had always felt clinical and neutral, now felt oppressive. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, creating harsh shadows. The white tile walls amplified every small sound. 10 minutes passed without incident, and I began to relax again. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just natural post-mortem sounds combined with a predisposition to be nervous because of where I work. Frank had mentioned that some nights, especially when working alone, the mind could play tricks. Then I heard it a third time, much louder than before. A distinct, unmistakable moan, low, sustained, almost like someone waking from deep sleep. The sound was clearly coming from the embalming table. My heart was racing now, but I forced myself to think rationally. This had to be post-mortem gas release, I told myself. Bodies can make surprisingly loud sounds as internal gases shift. It's not supernatural, it's not impossible. It's just biology that sounds unsettling because of the context. I walked closer to the embalming table, studying Mrs. Ward's body carefully. She remained completely still. No chest movement, no facial changes, nothing that would indicate any kind of consciousness or life. She had been dead for over 6 hours, pronounced by a doctor, examined by hospital staff. Dead people don't moan, I told myself. Whatever I'm hearing is explainable. But the unease had become genuine fear. I was alone in the basement of a funeral home at night, and a body that should be completely silent and still was making sounds that my rational mind couldn't quite dismiss as ordinary post-mortem phenomena. I decided to call Frank down from his apartment. He would be able to explain what I was hearing, to reassure me that this was normal, to restore my confidence that nothing impossible was happening. I decided this had gone far enough. Whatever was causing these sounds, I needed to investigate properly instead of standing here getting more frightened. Frank had probably told me a dozen times that imagination is the enemy of good work in this business. I needed to be rational, clinical, professional. I walked directly to the embalming table, telling myself I would prove once and for all that Mrs. Ward was simply a body exhibiting normal post-mortem phenomena. I would check her one more time, confirm she was deceased, and stop letting my imagination run wild. I reached for the sheet covering her upper body, intending to conduct another visual examination. The moment my hand touched the fabric near her shoulder, something grabbed my wrist. It was a hand, Mrs. Ward's hand. Cold, but unmistakably alive, her fingers wrapping around my wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes opened, unfocused and confused, looking directly at me. I screamed. I'm not proud of it, but I screamed like I had never screamed in my life. I jerked my arm back, breaking her weak grip, and stumbled backward until I hit the wall behind me. "Frank!" I shouted, my voice cracking with pure terror. "Frank, get down here now!" At first, I felt nothing. Her skin was cool, not quite cold like a corpse should be after 6 hours, but cooler than living tissue. I was about to remove my hand, convinced I was imagining everything, when I felt it. A pulse, weak, slow, perhaps 30 beats per minute, but definitely present. I moved my hand to her neck, checking her carotid artery. The pulse was there too, faint but steady. Mrs. Ward, who had been pronounced dead 6 hours earlier by a hospital physician, was alive. "Frank!" I shouted toward the ceiling, my voice cracking with panic. "Frank, get down here now!" I heard footsteps from above, and within seconds, Frank was rushing down the stairs. He burst into the preparation room, looking alarmed. "What's wrong?" "She's alive," I said, pointing at Mrs. Ward. "She has a pulse." She spoke. "She's breathing." Frank's expression shifted from alarm to skepticism. "Robert, post-mortem movement and sounds are normal. You've seen this before." "This isn't post-mortem movement," I insisted. "Check for yourself. She has a pulse. She's breathing." She said, "Help." Frank approached the embalming table, his expression showing the patience of someone humoring a nervous employee. But when he checked Mrs. Ward's pulse, his face changed completely. He moved quickly, checking her breathing, her pupils, her skin temperature. "Jesus Christ," Frank muttered. "She's alive. How is she alive?" Even as we stood there, Mrs. Ward's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused at first, moving without apparent awareness. Then gradually, they focused on Frank's face. Her lips moved, and a whisper emerged. "Where am I?" Frank's training took over. "Mrs. Ward, you're at a funeral home. There's been a mistake. We're calling an ambulance right now. You're going to be okay." I was already on the phone, dialing the operator to request emergency services. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the receiver. I explained the situation as clearly as I could, though I'm certain the operator thought I was either drunk or insane. People who have been dead for 6 hours don't wake up in funeral homes. The ambulance arrived within 15 minutes. The paramedics were as shocked as we had been. The lead paramedic, after checking Mrs. Ward's vital signs, radioed to the hospital. "We have a 76-year-old female who was pronounced dead this afternoon, but is now conscious and responsive. Vitals are weak but present. We need immediate transport, and the attending physician who pronounced her needs to be notified immediately." As they loaded Mrs. Ward onto the stretcher, she looked at me directly. "Thank you," she whispered. I couldn't move or speak, but I could hear everything. "I've been trying to tell someone I was alive." Those words still haunt me more than 50 years later. She had been conscious, aware, trapped in her own unresponsive body while everyone around her believed she was dead. She had been in the hospital morgue for hours. She had been transported to a funeral home. She had been lying on an embalming table while I prepared to begin procedures that would have been fatal if she hadn't managed to make those sounds that caught my attention. After the ambulance departed, Frank and I sat in his office, both of us trying to process what had just happened. Frank poured himself a whiskey, the only time I ever saw him drink at work, and tried to make sense of what had occurred. "I've heard of cases like this," Frank said slowly, still clearly shaken. "Rare situations where someone's vital signs become so faint that they can't be detected with standard examination. Heart rate drops so low you can't feel a pulse. Breathing becomes so shallow there's no visible chest movement. The person appears dead by every test available to us, but they're actually in some kind of minimal function state." "But she was in the hospital for 6 hours," I said. "Surely someone would have noticed if she was alive." "You'd think so," Frank agreed. "But if her condition was stable and her vital signs were below what we can detect, she would have appeared to be a corpse. No one would be checking a body that's been pronounced dead. She would have been moved to the morgue, prepared for transport, and delivered here without anyone examining her again because everyone assumed the doctor's pronouncement was correct." The investigation that followed revealed what had happened. Dr. Foster, the physician who had pronounced Mrs. Ward dead, had followed standard protocols. He had checked for heartbeat, breathing, and pupil response, finding none. Given Mrs. Ward's age, her pneumonia, and her deterioration over the previous days, her apparent death was not unexpected. What we later learned was that Mrs. Ward had experienced an extremely rare reaction to medication she had been given for her pneumonia. The medication, combined with her weakened condition, had caused her metabolic processes to slow to such a degree that her vital signs became undetectable by the examination methods we had available. This condition, while documented in medical literature, was so rare that most physicians never encountered it in their entire careers. Mrs. Ward's heart rate had dropped below 20 beats per minute, and her breathing had become so shallow that it produced no detectable chest movement or airflow. To every test we had in 1972, she appeared to be dead. Mrs. Ward spent 2 weeks in the hospital following her resurrection, as the local newspapers inevitably termed it. Doctors confirmed that she had been in a state of suspended animation, with brain activity continuing at minimal levels despite the absence of detectable vital signs. The most disturbing aspect of her case was her reported awareness during the time everyone believed she was dead. "I could hear conversations," Mrs. Ward told reporters who descended on the hospital to cover the story. "I heard the doctor pronounce me dead. I heard nurses preparing my body. I heard everything at the funeral home. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything to tell people I was still alive. It was like being buried alive, except I was in my own body." The case attracted significant medical attention and led to changes in death determination protocols. Hospitals implemented longer observation periods before pronouncing death, more sensitive monitoring equipment, and additional verification procedures. Funeral homes, including Frank's, established new protocols requiring more extensive checking for vital signs before beginning preparation procedures. For me personally, Mrs. Ward's case ended my career in the funeral business before it really began. I quit the following day, telling Frank I couldn't continue working in an environment where I would constantly fear that I might be preparing someone who was actually alive. Frank understood and didn't try to convince me to stay. "What happened last night would traumatize anyone," Frank told me. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. In fact, you saved that woman's life by listening to those sounds instead of dismissing them as normal post-mortem phenomena. A lot of people would have ignored what they heard and proceeded with preparation. But I couldn't escape the knowledge of what almost happened. If Mrs. Ward hadn't managed to make those sounds, if I had dismissed them as ordinary building noises or post-mortem gas release, if I had proceeded with the embalming process, she would have died on that table, conscious and aware as preservation chemicals were pumped through her cardiovascular system. The thought of that possibility gave me nightmares for years afterward. I would wake up sweating, imagining the moment when Mrs. Ward would have become aware of what was happening to her as the embalming began. The absolute horror of being conscious, but unable to move or speak while lethal procedures were performed. Mrs. Ward recovered completely and lived for another 12 years, passing away in 1984 at the age of 88 from a stroke. I learned about her death from the obituary in the local paper. The obituary mentioned her remarkable survival in 1972, describing her as the woman who came back from the dead and crediting her second chance at life to the funeral home employee whose careful attention to detail noticed something was wrong. I never worked in the funeral business again. The job at Holloway & Sons was my first and last experience with that industry. I went back to community college, eventually got a degree in accounting, and spent my career in a profession as far removed from death as I could manage. But Mrs. Ward's case stayed with me throughout my life. I'm 73 years old now, and I can still hear that first faint moan that made me pause in my work. I can still see her eyes opening on that embalming table, unfocused at first, and then gradually aware. I can still hear her whispered words. I couldn't move or speak, but I could hear everything. The case taught me something profound about the nature of death and consciousness. What we think of as death, the clear final boundary between life and non-life, might sometimes be far more ambiguous than we realize. The possibility that consciousness could persist in a body that shows no detectable vital signs represents a kind of horror that transcends any supernatural fear. Mrs. Ward's case also revealed the limitations of medical knowledge in 1972 and the terrible consequences that could result from those limitations. A respected physician following standard protocols had incorrectly pronounced someone dead. Hospital staff had processed and transported a body without detecting that life remained. I had been minutes away from beginning irreversible procedures on someone who was actually alive. The case received significant media coverage at the time and contributed to important changes in medical practice. But for me, it remains personal and immediate, rather than historical. When I close my eyes, I'm back in that preparation room, a 20-year-old kid hearing impossible sounds from a body that shouldn't be able to make them. Frank continued operating the funeral home for another 20 years before retiring. We remained in contact over the years, and he would occasionally mention Mrs. Ward's case when we talked. In 30 years running this place, Frank told me during one conversation in the 1990s, that was the only time I ever encountered a case like hers. But it was enough to change how I approached every single body that came through our doors after that night. I never again assumed that death was as certain as the paperwork claimed. The experience fundamentally changed my relationship with my own mortality as well. Most people think of death as a switch. One moment you're alive, the next you're not. But Mrs. Ward's case showed me that the transition might sometimes be more gradual, more ambiguous, with consciousness potentially persisting in states that appear to be death but aren't quite final. This knowledge brings no comfort. If anything, it makes death more frightening, not less. The possibility that you might be aware during what everyone believes is your death, conscious but unable to communicate, trapped in a body that appears lifeless, while medical professionals process you as a corpse. This is a horror that no amount of scientific understanding can diminish. Now, at 73, when I think about my own eventual death, I can't help but wonder about that boundary between consciousness and its absence. Will it be quick and clean, the switch flipping decisively? Or might there be some twilight period where I'm aware but unable to signal that awareness, trapped like Mrs. Ward was in the liminal space between life and death? These thoughts still haunt me more than 50 years after that November night in 1972. Mrs. Ward's case remains the most significant experience of my life, even though it lasted only a few hours and occurred when I was barely out of my teens. It taught me that the most frightening moments aren't always supernatural or mysterious. Sometimes they're the result of rare medical conditions, technological limitations, and the terrible consequences that can result when multiple improbable factors align in exactly the wrong way. The case also taught me the importance of trusting instincts even when rational explanations seem more likely. If I had dismissed those sounds as normal post-mortem phenomena, if I had ignored my unease and continued with my work, Mrs. Ward would have died on that table, and no one would have ever known she had been alive. This remains my most unexplained case, not because of supernatural elements or mysteries that could never be solved, but because it revealed how fragile and uncertain the boundary between life and death can be. It showed me that consciousness might persist in ways our medical knowledge cannot always detect, and that the people we believe to be gone might sometimes still be present, aware, and desperately trying to communicate their continued existence to a world that has already written them off as dead.